Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me here in Perth-Wellington tonight. And I also really want to say a special thanks to Wayne Baker and the PPC team for doing a marvelous job. You have to be cautious when you're on the phone with somebody and somebody says, you know, would you come on down to Perth-Wellington? And I said to Wayne, I said, well, I've got to be down in London around November 17th for something else. I said, so if you can make something fit around November 17th, you know, we'll do it. And sure enough, it was only a couple of days later, he said, we got something for around November 17th. So here we are. But I also want to say a very special thanks to Steve and Michelle. Your hospitality is so much appreciated, and thank you for being such good hosts. And of course, everyone here this evening who has braved the wintry roads and have made it to Perth-Wellington tonight, in where everybody knows of Kirksville now. One of those few communities that I've never driven through or been to until tonight. So, but I also want to say thanks. It's a wonderful to see a good friend and comrade in arms, Michael Schmidt here. Michael and I go back a long way. Back before elected office, I started a little group called the Lanark Landowners Association, and it grew into the Ontario Landowners Association. And our motto back then was, this land is our land, back off government. And I don't know how Michael and I came across one another, but we did. And one of our we had lots of interesting events, but one of them was in the battle for raw milk and the battle for freedom to put what you want into your body or not. Michael brought one of his cows down to Queen's Park, and we proceeded to milk the cow on the public pasture of Queen's Park. And the security guards were not so pleased with us that day, and they were insistent that we could not bring a cow on the Queen's Park, especially a cow that had those nasty horns. The horns were really, well, they were on the horns of a dilemma that day, because the cow was there, Michael and I was there, and many others, and we had a toast of raw milk on the grounds of Queen's Park.
I was there.
So, I've got a few things to say, but before I start, I have restrictions and prohibitions on what I'm allowed to say, where I'm allowed to be, who I'm allowed to be with. So I am prevented by law to speak about vaccine mandates, about masks, and about freedom convoys. So I will not be speaking on those subjects tonight. Not because I have nothing to say. I just don't want to spend any more time in the Crowbar Inn than I have to, and I've been there. So, they've also prevented me from being in places as well, or who I can communicate with. It is no doubt in my mind that our legal system is being utilized in an abusive fashion. Our governments see me as a threat and a danger that must be neutralized and silenced, and that they're willing to engage in all manner of falsehoods and dishonesty to undermine me and to silence my message. All I can say to them is, good luck. Good luck. I also... Many people are also... I want to clarify a couple things about my charges. There's been a few stories in the paper. So I'm going to just go over a little bit of that. During the lockdowns, I started a group called No More Lockdowns with a number of other people. And I remember quite clearly in the legislature, I said to Doug Ford and all other members, I said, I'm going to violate your law. I'm going to have rallies. I'm going to have rallies on the grounds of Queen's Park. I'm going to invite people. And I'm doing this because I know your laws are unconstitutional. They're invalid. And I'm going to take it to court. And I'm going to beat you in the courts. And I did this because I wanted it to be fast. About 2 years later, we're still not in the courts completely. But as a result, I have 25 charges against me for rallies across the province. Each one of those charges carries a maximum penalty of $1 million and up to a year in jail. One of those charges has been dropped. Right? One. But it's the first one. But I don't want them all dropped because I have a constitutional challenge. The arguments have been filed. They will be in examination in December and January. We have compelling arguments that were put forward. And we're going to have those arguments examined. And if the government doesn't back down, then we'll be in court in May or June of next year. And I'm going to beat them because our Charter of Rights and Freedoms are clear about our freedoms. And it's clear that they cannot be infringed upon without demonstrable justification. Our governments have never demonstrated any justification for these infringements. And should I be successful, all charges under the Reopening Ontario Act will be rendered withdrawn. Right? Won't affect the federal charges, but all the provincial charges. So that's the one charge I don't want them to withdraw. I don't want them to drop that one. Because I want not just to demonstrate that they were wrong in March of 2020, but they're wrong to such a degree that no other government will ever attempt to infringe on our rights and freedoms like these governments have done. Now, years ago, when we started the Landowners Association, our slogan was, "This land is our land, back off government." Right? We saw that government was getting too intrusive into our properties back then in 2002. Well, you can see where we are today. The intrusion has now entered into our lives and our bodies. Right? Into our lives and our bodies. Our government now says that they have ownership and they can determine what you must inject to live in our society. But I'm going to say to you, because I'm allowed to say this, COVID is an exaggerated hoax. Okay? It's an exaggerated fear. And I think the only bigger hoax that we have right now is climate change. And climate change is an underlying feature of the COVID narrative as well. They're connected. There's going to be a lot of things that I'd like to share tonight, but I much time. And I also forget many things. But I want to share a personal story of the past 2.5 years that I believe illustrates the path that we are on and where we might be headed. And then ask everyone here to consider what the path forward is as honest and free Canadians. And what I'm going to talk about just is 4 events or so. And they are just the tip of the iceberg of my time in the political world as an elected representative and over the last couple of years. But before I say the first event, there was something that happened at the beginning of tonight's event that is important. We sang "O Canada" and we said the Lord's Prayer. As a child, we all said the Lord's Prayer every day in school. Beginning of school every day. We sang "O Canada" every day. We also sang "God Save the Queen." Okay? And I mention this because there's an old adage about use it or lose it. Use it or lose it. And the complementary adage to that is practice makes perfect. Every day we practiced our faith in public, in school, in elementary school, in high school. Every day we told people what we believed in. We believed in God, we believed in country, we believed in Queen, right? And we practiced and we didn't lose it. But of course, how many public schools now say the Lord's Prayer? How many? How many municipal councils start their chambers, their proceedings off with the Lord's Prayer? Many. We have lost the things that we do not use. We are losing our freedom because we have not practiced it. We are losing our faith because we do not practice it. And I would say we have lost our thinking because we do not use it in this country in large part. So back on March 17th, 2020, the Ontario Legislature, Ford government, the Premier, declared a state of emergency and suspended the role of our legislature and elected representatives for 14 days. Elected representatives were no longer had purpose or function for 14 days. In addition to shuttering the legislature, he also became a de facto dictator, and he shuttered all businesses, schools, suspended health care and surgeries. Government offices and services were shuttered. Our parks, our playgrounds, our recreational activities. But this too was only for 14 days. Just 2 weeks to flatten the curve. I think we can all remember that. When that happened, well, that night, I sent a letter to Doug Ford and the entire cabinet. It's in my affidavit, in my constitutional argument, laying out my concerns. He and cabinet never responded. But I began a journey to learn everything I could of COVID-19, of this respiratory virus, and to learn it from credible sources from around the world. 2 weeks later, the legislature was recalled and the motion was before the legislature to extend the state of emergency, to extend the lockdowns. At that time, there was 124 elected representatives in the legislature. Most of them had agreed to stay at home and not discharge their responsibilities. I was in the House that day. During the debate, I spoke at length of what I had witnessed over the previous 2 weeks. My communications with my constituents, the emails that I had heard, the multitude of phone calls that I took day and night from people who were full of despair, anxiety, depression, and fear. People who were lonely, isolated, and terrified. Small business owners and workers who were fearing financial ruin. Families and loved ones who were beside themselves, not getting medical attention. And during that debate, I called for an investigation and an evaluation of the lockdowns and the state of emergency, as it was becoming evident to me at that time that the cure was far greater damage than the disease. And this I had forgotten about until I was doing up my affidavit and I was having to comb through my communications of 2 years. But many of my constituents then had sent me notes of appreciation and applause for me to be standing up and saying what I said, and to question the government on what was going on. But of course, of the 124 elected members, I was the only one who showed dissent and asked for an evaluation. The second event was a little bit later in the middle of April. So keep this in mind. I speak out at the beginning of COVID, and my constituents were overwhelmingly supportive of my view. By mid-April, it had become ever more clear to me, ever more evident, that COVID and the danger of it was exaggerated. And I sent an email out to about 20,000 people in my riding. And I explained my position. And I said, we can all take a deep breath now. We can see the evidence that COVID is much like the seasonal flu. That's what I said. And I gave some evidence to support that. The evidence I gave was that of the Diamond Princess. Everybody remember the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess? Big news back in January, February, March of 2020. Here was this luxury cruise liner with about 4,000 people on board that had a COVID case, and then a second COVID case, and multiple COVID cases. And it was quarantined. Nobody was allowed in or off, on or off that vessel for 6 weeks. And it captured the news. But when you look at the facts beyond the headlines, and I did that in March, at the end of March, in the beginning of April. And on March 2nd, when the Diamond Princess was allowed to disembark, 7 people had died out of 4,000. They were the elderly passengers. None of the crew had any fatalities, the younger crew members. And that, some people may say, well, that's still a lot. But then I did a little more digging, and it is not uncommon on a cruise ship of that size, with that many passengers. It happens all the time. About one death per cruise is the normal situation. That's the context. So, if that cruise ship had just been going on, it was likely to have 6 deaths in those 6 weeks. During COVID, it had 7. And it was it was just like a controlled laboratory experiment that disproved every computer model that we were being told of. Disproved it completely. But who talked about it? Who talked about it other than in a case of fear, drama, and the apocalypse? So when I sent that email out, I was expecting a similar response to what I had gotten just a few weeks ago. Well, was I in for a shock? The volume of hatred and vitriol and people calling for my family and I to die from COVID, that the animus, the scorn and the ridicule was astonishing. And obviously I said, okay. Something had altered. Something had altered. And I would spend the next 2.5 years trying to figure out what had happened to us. And I still don't have all the answers by any means. So, but something had happened to our society that where once we had been calm and rational, polite, and kind, Canadian society and temperament had turned into an unruly, hateful mob. There's no other words that and fearful mob as well. And that also told me that we had diverged and we are now taking on a path to a very dark place. A place that we can't really know how dark it will be, but a path that we knew, that I knew, that we had to alter from. And over the next, event is, for the next 2 years, I would hold dozens and dozens of rallies across the province. I would offend the Reopening Ontario Act and the COVID mandates each and every time in such a public manner as I could. When they said that I was not allowed to have people at my home for Christmas, I had 20 people and I took a picture of us all at that kitchen table and I put it out on Twitter and I said, come and get me. Come and get me. No government will ever tell me how many and who is going to be allowed in my house. My house. I decide who comes in it and how many. Right? If government wants to know who's in my house, then they can come and buy it from me. But until that day, I decide. And I went across the province and I hugged and greeted and spoke with thousands of people. And over 2 years, I was never sick. None of my family were ever sick. My children, my grandchildren, my wife were never sick. And it was obvious just how dangerous is this thing. Because I'm supposed to be one of the ones at risk, in my 60s. I've lost a little bit of weight because now I'm doing some real work around the home and not just talking all the time. Overweight. I smoke too much. I drink too much. I've got a few bad habits. And I don't think I was very unique. Very unique at all. Because nobody I knew got sick. But the last event I want to talk about was on February 17th and February 18th of this year. They're dates that I won't ever forget. For the first time in my life, I witnessed police officers attacking peaceful, friendly, loving citizens and protesters. They used physical violence, batons, tear gas, and horses to trample people and our freedoms to peacefully assemble and to express a dissenting view on public policy. What was even worse, as we saw later on, and during the event, many police were expressing glee and happiness of the violence that they had perpetrated on Canadian citizens. And also, many Canadians were cheering on the abuse and the violence against their friends, family members, and neighbors. It was a day that I realized that it was not just, I've always known that government is corrupt. I've always known that. Spending 15 years in Parliament just reinforced what I already knew and gave me the evidence of that. But that day I realized it is not just our governments that are corrupt and distorted. It is every institution in our country. Our police, our education system, our many churches took money from governments to advance and advocate for policies such as masking and other things, and the closure of their congregations. Go through it. Our institutions are also corrupt. Corrupt in a different fashion. I have no evidence, as I do with politics, of being corrupted by money in exchange for decisions. But a corruption nonetheless, because they are instituted to be safeguards of our freedoms and our families. And they have failed. They have failed miserably. This time of, that time was, in Ottawa, was full of joy. It was full of friendship. It was exuberant. It was exhilarating. It was festive. It was marvelous. It was probably, I typically hate being in Ottawa, but I love being in Ottawa in February, right? And we heard our Prime Minister, our media, our police, our institutions describe this festive occasion as an insurrection by white supremacists, a misogynist, homophobic threat to our democracy. Our Prime Minister and our institutions are both dishonest and duplicitous. They knowingly lied to the people of Canada. Knowingly. And that, in politics we often see little white lies. We call it spin. It's where the government only tells you the part of the story that they want you to hear. And they don't tell you the important, relevant facts of the story. This time, our government's outright lied to the people of Canada. And he was backed up by our media. He was backed up by our police. He was backed up by many people in this country. Backed up by our own friends, families, members, and neighbors. You know, we can point the finger at Justin Trudeau, but he couldn't have done what he did without the support of the Canadian public. Same with Doug Ford. And that's the day I realized that before we've solved this problem politically, we have to recognize a fundamental fact. Politicians are followers. They are not leaders. They follow public opinion, or they follow the mob. They follow what will get them to power. Right? They're not in this business to represent your interests. They're not in this business for the well-being and commonwealth of our communities. They are in this business for power. Their power. They will do whatever it takes to retain power, keep it, or take it from the other guys. I realized that to solve this problem politically, which we will do, we have to first solve the problem that is a cultural war that is going on in our society. Before we can get politics to actually defend our freedoms, defend justice, democracy, we must first win the cultural war that we've been engaged in, and realize that it is not just Justin Trudeau who needs to be defeated. And that's where I made the decision. And as Michael said earlier, and I believe Janice said, you know, and I know this to be true, you know, because I fought for a long time before I got into elected office. And I thought that being in elected office would be the most appropriate place for me to advocate for freedom, justice, and democracy. And maybe it is, but I can tell you, we did it with the landowners. We can all be just as effective and even more effective right here in our communities, right here in our homes. We don't need Parliament to have a voice. We don't need Parliament to be influential. So each and every person can make a difference. Okay. And I decided that to speak clearly about these matters, I needed to be free from the constraints of elected office. I wanted to be able to go out and say, I think a lot of people said that I called a spade when I was in office. I'm going to be a little bit more blunt, but I'm not in office. I now, you know, when you're in office, you have an obligation to represent your constituents as well. You have to, even when they want things that you conscientiously oppose, you still need to represent that interest. I don't need to do that anymore. I can just speak and say what I think and know to be true. And that's how we need to restore our faith We need to use and not lose our faith, our freedom. We have to practice and restore our families and our personal responsibility. That's what I'm engaged in now, in the culture war. Because otherwise, this road that we are on will become much darker. It'll become much more sinister. And our children and our grandchildren will either bear the costs of our failure, or they will reap the rewards and the fruits of our success. It is for them that we have to do this. Just as our forefathers, as my grandfather and father and so many others fought to ensure that we would inherit a free, just, and prosperous country. We must do the same for our children and our grandchildren. So, in the coming days and weeks, you're going to see a little bit more of me, whether you like it or not. I'm going to have to say a few more things. I'm going to be launching a new initiative with Jim Torma as well. Many people will know Jim from the PPC. We've got a few things that we'll be announcing soon. But again, we'll just go back. How do we go forward? By practicing, by using and not losing those attributes, those concepts, those characteristics that we know. Right? It is to live our lives free of any intimidation and free to speak our minds at any time. It is to live our lives guided with a strong moral compass and to help and guide those who have lost theirs. It is to live our lives with forbearance and honesty and counter this age of dishonesty that we are in. And I say that, like, I'll just give a couple of examples. We have a person who was nominated and placed on the highest court of the most powerful free nation in the world, the United States. A person who was nominated and became a Supreme Court justice, who, when asked, "Can you define what a woman is?" was unable to do so. Right? Unable. And said, "Well, I'm no biology expert." Right? That's dishonest. That's being a liar. Right? If you can't know what a woman is, how can you possibly rule on the highest matters of law in the land? Right? And I'll give you another example that we've all seen recently is this school teacher in Halton, with the big costume boots. Right? And like, it was even ridiculous. Like, the first time I saw that story, they referred to these things as prosthetics. Like, I know what a prosthetic is. I know what a prosthetic leg is. I know what prosthetics are. They are not prosthetics. Right? I don't care what it is. They're costumes. They're a mockery of a woman. But there's an interesting element to that story. And because I think the real part of that story is that that teacher is a shop teacher, not like any shop teacher I had when I was in high school. Okay? But in a high school of about 1,500 students, the school board had a meeting to deal with this. You may have seen it on Rebel News. David Menzies was there and different things.
He dressed up.
But, you know, like there was 30 or 40 parents there. 30 or 40 parents. Like, who could not be offended by the actions of that teacher? And of course, who could not be offended by the position of the school board that says, we're not going to do anything about it, right? Making a mockery of our language, making a mockery of our values, making a mockery of education. And only a handful, only a small handful of parents thought it was important enough to take an hour or two of their time and be there. That's the story. Use it or lose it. If you're not going to be engaged, if you're not going to stand up, if you're not going to speak up, don't be surprised that we've got a mockery of everything. And it will be these things. We can see through history where this takes us to. It's not good. Michael alluded to the discussion with his parents in Germany. Right? There is a time to fight. There is a time to be awake. There is a time to be alert. And the time is not when it's too late. We have a job to do. And we also have to accept and embrace our faith. We have to encourage the saying of the Lord's Prayer. When somebody says, we can't do that at our council meeting. No, yes, you can. And it's a good thing. It is a good thing. Because without faith, from faith, we derive our freedom. We derive our conscience and our ability to object. Faith is a foundation for a free and just society. And we have to also recognize that a good life is a life with adversity, with burden. A good life is not a life that is soft, convenient, and comfy. That's not where meaning, to do your best in life is to meet the challenges, is to carry the burdens, and to overcome them. That's what our fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers taught us. Overcome. And, you know, we saw this story in St. Catherine's this week about a man. I don't know if anybody saw this story. A man who is potentially going to lose his home and be homeless. What was his solution? He went to his doctor and asked his doctor to approve his application to die. Government funded, executed death. And his doctor agreed. His doctor agreed that being homeless is a justifiable use of the suicide, of death. And we've seen this, and we've brought it out to MAID, and we're broadening it out even further. They're now talking about children may also apply for MAID. Children. Just like, you know, and we all know this. You know, you can't You can't legally drink until you're 19. You can't buy cigarettes until you're 19. You can't get a tattoo or go to a tanning parlor until you're 16 or whatever. But here the government is saying a child can apply for death. People with mental illnesses can apply for death. This is because we have said a life without convenience is not a life worth living. That's what we're saying to people. And it's not true. Right? There's a lot of things that we're going to be able to do. But we must rebuild our country and our culture. And just as our ancestors worked night and day to carve a great nation, carve a great culture out of the swamps and the woodlands and the rocks of the Canadian Shield that we are blessed to inherit, we must also work day and night. We must all become models and change the unruly mob for them to understand and aspire to what we're saying. Just as we did with the landowners years ago, where we said, this land is our land, back off government. We must also be assertive and say, my freedom is my freedom, back off government. My family is my family, back off government. But we can continue to say, my land is my land, and back off government. Thank you very much. Been a pleasure being here tonight. We're going to have some questions and answers, I think, after, but I'll let that